You know how we're taught that American wealth was built exclusively by a select few industrial titans, all of them white men with recognizable names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt. But what if I told you that in the early 1900s, there was a black woman who became so extraordinarily wealthy that she owned more land than almost any other individual in America, held assets worth hundreds of millions in today's dollars, and yet her name has been systematically erased from the history books you studied in school? Her name was Sarah Rector, and by the time she was 12 years old, this young black girl owned an oil-producing empire that generated more daily income than most Americans earned in a year. But her story begins not with wealth and prosperity, but with one of the most insidious policies ever designed to strip Native Americans and African Americans of their dignity, their rights, and ultimately their land. In the late 1800s, after the Civil War finally ended the brutal institution of slavery, thousands of formerly enslaved black people found themselves in a peculiar and dangerous situation. They were free in name but possessed nothing, no land, no resources, no capital to build lives upon, and many of these freedom seekers were adopted into Native American tribes, particularly the Creek Nation in what would become Oklahoma, because these tribes had their own complex and often painful relationship with slavery. And when the federal government began parceling out land allotments to Creek citizens as part of their systematic dismantling of tribal sovereignty, these Black Creek members, called Creek freedmen, were entitled to receive their own plots of land just like any other tribal citizen. Sarah Rector was born in 1902 in the small town of Taft, Oklahoma, to parents who had been Creek freedmen, and like other Creek citizens, Sarah received her land allotment when she was just a child. A seemingly worthless 160-acre plot in Creek County that was rocky, barren, and appeared absolutely unsuitable for farming, the kind of land that white settlers had already passed over because they saw no value in it whatsoever. And this is where the story takes its first dramatic turn, because the government officials and land speculators who had carefully kept the good land for white settlers and relegated the poorest parcels to black and native families had no idea what lay beneath the surface of Sarah's worthless allotment. In 1913, when Sarah was just 11 years old, the Glen Pool oil field, which had been producing black gold for several years, extended its reach onto her property, and suddenly this barren, rocky plot that nobody wanted began gushing oil at a rate that stunned even the most experienced wildcatters in the region. We're talking about 2,500 barrels of oil per day flowing from her land, and at the prices of that era, this translated to approximately $300 per day in revenue, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that the average American worker in 1913 earned about $2 per day, meaning this 12-year-old black girl was earning more in a single day than most working Americans earned in 5 months. The news of Sarah Rector's sudden wealth spread like wildfire through Oklahoma and beyond. Newspapers across the country began running stories about the colored oil queen and the richest colored girl in America. And while some of these stories celebrated her remarkable fortune, many were tinged with the racism and patronizing attitudes of the era, questioning whether a black child could possibly manage such wealth, suggesting that she needed white guardians to protect her from herself, and, in some cases, openly scheming about how to separate Sarah from her newfound fortune. You see, under Oklahoma law at the time, all black and Native American children who inherited or earned significant wealth were declared incompetent by default and placed under the guardianship of white administrators appointed by the courts, supposedly to protect these children from being swindled or making poor financial decisions, but in reality, this system was designed to give white men legal control over black and native wealth, allowing them to extract fees, make decisions that benefited themselves, and in many cases simply steal the assets they were supposed to be protecting. Sarah Rector was immediately assigned a white guardian, a local businessman who was supposed to manage her estate in her best interest, but like so many guardians in this corrupt system, he began treating Sarah's oil wealth as his personal bank account. And this is where Sarah's father, Joseph Rector, despite being a poor farmer with limited formal education, showed the kind of courage and determination that would ultimately save his daughter's fortune. Joseph Rector was not going to stand by and watch white men steal his daughter's inheritance. So he began fighting back through the only channels available to him, writing letters to state officials, seeking legal counsel, and making enough noise that eventually the case caught the attention of the NAACP and black newspapers across the country, who began investigating the guardianship system and exposing its systematic theft of black wealth. And after months of pressure, scrutiny, and legal maneuvering, Sarah's guardian was finally removed and replaced. But the attempts to control and steal her wealth didn't stop there. As Sarah's oil revenue continued to flow and her wealth grew to staggering proportions, estimated at over $1 million by the time she was a teenager, which would be worth approximately $30 million or more in today's dollars. White fortune hunters from across the country began descending on Oklahoma with marriage proposals, inheritance schemes, and fraudulent business opportunities, all designed to get close to Sarah and her money, and the newspapers of the era treated this predatory behavior as entertainment, running stories with headlines that today would make your stomach turn, describing grown white men's attempts to court and marry a black child as though it were romantic rather than the predatory, racist exploitation it actually was. But here's what makes Sarah Rector's story even more remarkable and more tragic. She wasn't just fighting off individual con artists and corrupt guardians. She was fighting against an entire legal and social system designed to prevent black Americans from accumulating and maintaining generational wealth. And despite these overwhelming obstacles, despite being a child, despite being black in early 20th century America, despite being female in an era when women had barely won the right to vote, Sarah Rector managed to not only keep her wealth but grow it substantially. By 1914, at age 12, Sarah's daily oil revenue had grown to over $300, and newspapers reported that she was receiving as many as 200 letters per day from people seeking money, proposing marriage, offering business deals, or simply asking for help, and her father had to hire staff just to sort through the correspondence and protect his daughter from the constant onslaught of people trying to exploit her wealth. And the family made the strategic decision to move to Kansas City, Missouri, where the black community was more established, where they could access better legal protection, and where Sarah could receive the education befitting someone of her wealth and status without the constant interference and racism of Oklahoma. In Kansas City, Sarah Rector became a fixture of black high society. She attended the best schools available to black students, dressed in fine clothes, lived in a grand home, and became living proof that black Americans, when given access to resources and opportunity, could achieve the same levels of wealth and sophistication as any white American. But even in Kansas City, even with all her wealth, Sarah still faced the daily indignities and restrictions of Jim Crow America. She couldn't eat in most restaurants, couldn't stay in most hotels, couldn't shop in many stores, and had to navigate a world that simultaneously envied her wealth and despised her blackness. The most heartbreaking aspect of Sarah Rector's story is how thoroughly she has been erased from American history. When we teach children about American wealth and the age of industrial fortunes, we mention the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, we talk about oil barons and railroad magnates and steel tycoons, all of them white men whose names are immortalized in universities, foundations, and history books. But Sarah Rector, who at age 12 owned more oil-producing land than most of these men had at the start of their careers, who generated wealth at a rate that rivaled some of the most successful businessmen of her era, whose story represents one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in American history, has been virtually forgotten, her name absent from most history textbooks, her achievements unmentioned in discussions of American wealth, her remarkable life reduced to a footnote in the larger narrative of American prosperity. Sarah eventually married and had 3 sons, and she managed her wealth carefully throughout her life, making investments, purchasing real estate, and maintaining the fortune that so many had tried to steal from her. But the oil that had gushed so profusely from her land in her youth eventually slowed, as all oil fields eventually do, and by the time she reached middle age, her wealth had diminished significantly, not because of poor management or lavish spending, but because oil is a finite, resource, and because the legal fees, guardian fees, and systemic extraction of her wealth during her childhood had taken their toll. She died in 1967 at the age of 65, having lived through the entire span of the Jim Crow era, having witnessed the birth of the civil rights movement, and having experienced both extraordinary wealth and its eventual decline. But what makes her story so important isn't just the remarkable nature of her individual experience. It's what her story reveals about the systematic erasure of Black wealth and Black achievement in American history. Because Sarah Rector was not an anomaly. She was not the only Black American who achieved extraordinary success in the early 20th century. There were Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Black entrepreneurs had built the wealthiest Black community in America until white mobs burned it to the ground in 1921. There were Black farmers who owned thousands of acres, Black businesspeople who built thriving enterprises, Black professionals who accumulated significant wealth. But these stories have been systematically excluded from the narrative of American success, erased from our textbooks, omitted from our cultural memory, because acknowledging Black wealth and Black achievement complicates the racist narratives that justified segregation, discrimination, and the ongoing economic oppression of Black Americans. When you look at Sarah Rector's story, you begin to understand why so few Black families have been able to build and maintain generational wealth in America. It's not because of any lack of ability, intelligence, or work ethic. It's because the system was deliberately designed to prevent Black wealth accumulation through legal mechanisms like the guardianship laws that allowed white administrators to control Black assets, through violence like the Tulsa Massacre that destroyed Black economic centers, through discriminatory policies like redlining that prevented Black families from buying property and appreciating neighborhoods, through systematic exclusion from the GI Bill and other wealth-building programs that created the white middle class after World War II, and through ongoing discrimination in lending, employment, and business opportunities that continues to this day. Sarah Rector's story also reveals the particular vulnerabilities that Black women have faced in American society. She was valuable to white society only insofar as her wealth could be extracted and controlled. She was exoticized and objectified by newspapers that described her appearance in disturbing detail. She was targeted by predatory men who saw her not as a child to be protected but as a prize to be won. And even as an adult, even with all her wealth, she still had to navigate a world that saw her first as a Black woman and only secondarily as a wealthy individual. A world where her race and gender made her vulnerable in ways that white wealthy individuals never experienced. Today, when we talk about the wealth gap between white and Black Americans, when we discuss the fact that the median white family has roughly 10 times the wealth of the median Black family, when we examine how few Black Americans have been able to achieve and maintain significant wealth across generations, we need to remember stories like Sarah Rector's, because her story illustrates exactly how the system worked and continues to work to prevent Black wealth accumulation. It shows us that even when Black Americans managed to acquire significant assets, even when they had legal ownership of valuable resources, the system found ways to extract, control, and ultimately diminish that wealth through legal manipulation, outright theft, and systematic discrimination. The erasure of Sarah Rector from American history is not accidental. It's not simply an oversight or a matter of limited space in textbooks. It's a deliberate choice about which stories get told and which stories get buried, because Sarah Rector's story, if widely known, would fundamentally challenge the narrative that American wealth was built exclusively by white innovation and white hard work. It would force us to acknowledge that Black Americans, despite facing unimaginable obstacles, still managed to achieve extraordinary success when given even the smallest opportunity, and it would require us to confront the uncomfortable truth that much of the wealth gap we see today is not the result of different cultural values or work ethics, but the direct result of systematic policies designed to keep Black Americans from building and keeping wealth. So the next time someone tells you that the wealth gap exists because of cultural differences or lack of financial literacy or poor decision-making in Black communities, remember Sarah Rector. Remember that she was 12 years old when she became one of the wealthiest individuals in America. Remember that she had to fight off an entire system designed to steal her wealth. Remember that despite her remarkable success, despite her careful management of her assets, despite doing everything right, her name has been virtually erased from history, while white men who started with far more advantages and faced far fewer obstacles are celebrated as American heroes and business geniuses. Sarah Rector's story deserves to be taught in every American history class. Her name deserves to be as recognizable as any Rockefeller or Carnegie. Her achievements deserve to be celebrated as an extraordinary example of Black excellence and perseverance in the face of systematic oppression. And her erasure from our collective memory should serve as a reminder of how many other Black stories, Black achievements, and Black contributions have been deliberately excluded from the narrative we tell about American history, because for every Sarah Rector whose story we've been able to recover, there are countless others whose names and achievements have been lost forever, buried under the weight of racism, discrimination, and historical erasure. This is why we have to do the work of recovering these stories, why we have to dig through archives and old newspapers and historical records to find the Black Americans who achieved extraordinary things, who built wealth, who made contributions, who lived remarkable lives. Because every story we recover is an act of resistance against the erasure that has defined so much of Black history. Every name we speak is a small victory against the forces that tried to bury these achievements. And every time we share these stories, we're helping to build a more complete, more honest, more accurate understanding of American history that includes the full spectrum of Black achievement, Black excellence, and Black contributions to this nation. Sarah Rector was the richest Black woman in America at age 12. She owned an oil empire. She generated wealth that rivaled some of the most successful businessmen of her era. She fought off systematic attempts to steal her fortune. She maintained her dignity and her wealth despite living in Jim Crow America, and she deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and honored as one of the most remarkable figures in American history. So share her story, speak her name, and remember that Black excellence is not new. It's been here all along, systematically erased, deliberately excluded, but persistent, powerful, and worthy of recognition. Because Sarah Rector's story is not just her story. It's our story, it's American history, and it's time we started treating it that way.